Hello Year 2, how are you? And welcome to today's reading lesson. Now in our reading lesson yesterday, we were focusing on the skill of prediction and we were using chapter 4 to make our predictions, to predict what might happen next, to look into the future about what might happen. Now today we're going to be carrying on reading Fantastic Mr. Fox, focusing on chapter 5, which is called The Terrible Traptors. Oh, I wonder what that chapter might be about. Well, we're going to be using the skill today of inference. So we're going to be using our own knowledge that we already have and what we've read to make inferences, okay, to answer inference questions. And again, like every lesson, we are going to be looking at some vocabulary. So we're going to be looking at a word and the words around it to try and work out the word's meaning. Now, before we do any of that, I want to see how much you can remember from the last couple of lessons on Fantastic Mr. Fox. So over the last few lessons, we have looked at some vocabulary and I want to see how much of that vocabulary you have remembered. So here you have 3 definitions. You have with gentleness, kindness and love, old and torn, and dark and difficult to see through. Now, these are all words that we have looked at together, and I have given you these exact definitions when I've spoken about them. So now what you need to do is pause the video and have a go. Can you find the word that I'm giving the definition for? Okay, yeah, so let's go through them together. The first one, with gentleness, kindness, and love. Now, that is describing how you're doing something, isn't it? You do something with gentleness, with kindness, and with love. So therefore, what type of word are we going to be looking for? Well, an adverb describes a verb, doesn't it? So we are looking for an adverb. Now, can you remember an adverb that we read yesterday that means with gentleness, kindness, and love? Yes, that's right. Tenderly meant that, didn't it? So there we go. I have given you the definition for tenderly. Now, can you remember where tenderly was used in the story? Fantastic. It said Mrs. Fox was tenderly licking the stump of Mr. Fox's tail because he'd been shot by the farmer's, hadn't he? And his tail was hurting. And because it was hurting, she was licking it gently. Okay, the next one, old and torn. What type of word will we be looking for here? Well, old and torn are both adjectives, so maybe we're going to be looking for an adjective for our word. Now, what in the story was old and torn, and what was used to describe it? Yes, that's right. Tattered was used to describe it. And what was it describing? Well, it was describing the poor, tattered, blood-stained remains of her fox's tail. Okay, because the farmers had injured Fantastic Mr. Fox and a part of his tail had been left on the floor and it was tattered, so it was old and torn. Okay, the last one, dark and difficult to see through. Now again, dark and difficult are both adjectives. So again, we're looking for an adjective. What was dark and difficult to see through in the story? And what word was used to describe it? Yes, that's right. Do you remember when Mr. Fox was in the forest and it was very dark? He described the forest as murky. Okay, and it said in the story, oh, it wasn't a forest, it was a wood. The wood was murky and very still. Okay, so there we go. He has used murky because it was at night and it was very dark. So he's used that to describe the wood. Well done. If you remembered the definitions for those words, I'm very impressed. And I'll be testing you again in a couple of days on a couple of other words. Now let's move on to today. So as I said, we are doing inference today and we have got our friend here, like we've had our friends the last few times, Inference Iggy. Can you see him? He's got his looking glass. Now, why do you think, sorry, not a looking glass, a magnifying glass. And why do you think he's got his magnifying glass? Well, that's because he's a detective, isn't he? Because when we do inference, we are acting like detectives. So he's going to help us make inferences from the text. And this means he is here to help you hunt for clues in the text. So there you go, his magnifying glass. As a detective, he is looking for different clues in the text that will help you answer the question. Because remember, with inference, you do not get told the answer explicitly in the story. You have to use the clues and what you already know to come up with an answer. So it might help ask you how someone is feeling. So like we did with the bubble story, we inferred how Gabby was feeling. Why somebody did something. So it might give you some clues in the text why somebody might have done something later on in the text, and then why something is happening right now. Okay, so here are some example questions that you might have for inference. So these are the types of questions that Inference Iggy could ask you. So the first one is a tick box activity, and it asks you to tick one. Now, if it asks you to tick one, you only tick one because you won't get the mark if you tick more than one. So it says, Molly thought that something with many arms had been in the garden. Why did she think that? So, what in the garden made her think that something with many arms had been in the garden? So we've got her racetrack had been eaten up, dropped, picked up, and broken. And you need to choose one of those and put a tick in the box. Well, we haven't read that story, so we can't answer that question, but we might get similar questions for our fantastic Mr. Fox story. Okay, let's have a look at the one under it. How can you tell that it was late when Monster and Frog woke up? Okay, so maybe in the text, it tells you that it's dark outside. Maybe the moon is out. And even though it doesn't tell you that it's nighttime, those two things in the text, those two clues, help us to infer that it is nighttime. Okay. Then we've got give two things the greedy man does to tell you he could not wait for the seed to grow. Wow, we haven't read this story again, but maybe in the story it's told us that the man is pacing up and down, okay? And we know that if you're pacing, you're waiting for something and you're quite anxious about it. Or maybe he was complaining in the story. So then, even though it doesn't tell us that he could not wait for the seed to grow, maybe those two clues in the text can help us answer that question. Then the next one, why did the greedy man start clapping his hands in delight? Well, maybe from the question before, maybe the seed started to grow and he was clapping his hands in delight because the seed had grown. But it doesn't actually say in the text, the greedy man started clapping his hands in delight because the seed started to grow. Okay, we have to infer that from what we already know. So again, Inference Iggy might also ask you, how do you think this character is feeling? And why do you think that, like we did with Gabby? Why do you think the author uses this particular word? So maybe he uses the word glum. Why does he use the word glum? Well, we know that glum is sad. And when Gabby was on the beach, she was on her own. So maybe she's sad because she's lonely on the beach, but it doesn't tell us that in the text. We just have to infer it from what we know, what we've seen. What effect did the author want to create by? Find words which show how the character feels about. So this time, rather than us having to infer how the character feels, we need to find words which show that the character feels that way. And how do you know that the character is feeling? So again, we'd probably look for some words for that question too. Okay, so that is who Inference Iggy is, and that is what he helps us to do. So shall we start reading our chapter 5 of Fantastic Mr. Fox? So I've sent you this on Year 2 Reading, 3rd of February, Resource 1, if you want to follow it. But if you want to just listen to me for now, that is also fine. So Chapter 5, The Terrible Tractors. As the sun rose the next morning, Boggis and Bunce and Bean were still digging. They had dug a hole so deep you could have put a house into it. But they had not yet come to the end of the fox's tunnel. They were all very tired and cross. Dang and blast, said Boggis. Whose rotten idea was this? Bean's idea, said Bunce. Boggis and Bunce both stared at Bean. Bean took another swig of cider, then put the flask back into his pocket without offering it to the others. Listen, he said angrily. I want that fox. I'm going to get that fox. I'm not giving in till I've strung him up over my front porch, dead as a dumpling. We can't get him by digging, that's for sure, said the fat Boggis. I've had enough of digging. Bunce, the little pot-bellied dwarf looked up at Bean and said, "Have you got any more stupid ideas then?" "What?" said Bean. "I can't hear you." Bean never took a bath. Ooh. He never even washed. As a result, his earlobes were clogged with all kinds of muck and wax and bits of chewing gum and dead flies and stuff like that. This made him deaf. "Speak louder," he said to Bunce, and Bunce shouted back, "Got any more stupid ideas?" Okay, so on that page, it tells us that as a result, his earlobes were clogged. Okay, what does it mean if something is clogged? Well, let's have a look what's around the word in the text. It says it's clogged with all kinds of muck and wax and bits of chewing gum and dead flies and stuff like that. So there's lots of different things in his ear. And we know that because of this, he can't hear anything. So what do you think the word clogged means? Well, let's have a look together. So clogged is an adjective because it's describing Farmer Bean's earlobes, okay? And it's one syllable. Are you ready to clap along with me? 3, 2, 1, clogged. There we go. And it means it's blocked, so nothing can pass through it. So because Farmer Bean had so much in his ears because he didn't wash them, the sound couldn't get into his ear for him to hear. So nothing could pass through it because it was clogged up. It was full of all that rubbish. So some synonyms for this are blocked and jammed. Something's jammed packed. You can't get anything else in. Okay, and then we have the antonym, empty. So Farmer Bean's ears definitely weren't empty, were they? Because they were full of all that stuff that they've described there.